The moment a man in uniform says, "You don't belong here," the question isn't who he's talking to, the question is what happens when he's wrong. The late afternoon sun hung low over downtown Brookside, casting long shadows across the city plaza as office workers hurried home and tourists drifted between food carts and street musicians. It looked like an ordinary Friday, the kind of evening that disappeared into memory before the weekend even began. But in the center of the plaza, something was about to happen that no one would forget. Marcus Reed walked through the crowd with calm, measured steps, a leather folder tucked beneath his arm and a quiet focus in his eyes. At 38 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who didn't need attention to feel important. His navy jacket was neatly pressed, his shoes polished, his expression composed. He glanced briefly at his watch. He was running a few minutes behind, but not enough to worry. Around him, conversations blended into a steady hum. The smell of roasted nuts drifted through the air. A saxophone player performed near the fountain. Everything felt normal. Then a sharp voice cut through the noise. "Sir. Stop right there." Several heads turned. Marcus stopped and looked over his shoulder. Approaching him was Officer Ethan Brooks, a veteran police officer known throughout the district for his strict attitude and quick judgments. His posture was rigid. His eyes were fixed on Marcus. The atmosphere shifted immediately. People slowed their pace. Some instinctively stepped aside. Ethan approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" he asked. Marcus remained polite. "Just heading to a meeting, officer." The answer should have ended the conversation. It didn't. Ethan's gaze lingered. He asked another question. Then another. Within moments, what began as a casual stop felt like a public examination. The plaza grew quieter. People watched from a distance, pretending not to stare while listening to every word. Marcus answered calmly, never raising his voice, never showing frustration. Yet something about his composure seemed to irritate Ethan even more. The officer's questions became sharper. His tone grew colder. A teenager near the fountain quietly pulled out a phone. Then another person did the same. Marcus noticed but said nothing. The golden sunlight reflected off the windows of nearby buildings, bathing the scene in an almost cinematic glow. For a moment, Ethan looked around and seemed satisfied by the growing audience. The officer believed he was in control. Everyone else believed it too. What none of them noticed was the black SUV parked half a block away. Or the missed call waiting on Marcus's phone. Or the fact that 3 different people in separate locations were already wondering why he hadn't arrived. Standing in the center of the plaza, surrounded by curious strangers and silent cameras, Marcus finally looked directly at the officer and spoke in a calm voice that carried farther than anyone expected. "Officer," he said, "you should be very careful about what happens next." A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face. He thought it was a warning. In reality, it was a promise. For several long seconds, neither man moved. The sounds of the city slowly returned, but something had changed. People who had been walking through the plaza now lingered near the edges, pretending to check their phones while keeping their eyes fixed on the scene. Officer Ethan Brooks folded his arms and studied Marcus Reed with growing suspicion. There was something about the man's calmness that felt unusual. Most people became nervous when confronted in public. Most people rushed to explain themselves. Marcus did neither. He simply stood there beneath the fading sunlight, composed and patient, as if he understood something no one else did. Ethan took a step closer. "You seem awfully confident for someone being questioned," he said. Marcus offered a polite smile. "Confidence comes from knowing who you are." The answer irritated Ethan more than he expected. Around them, the city continued moving. Traffic rolled through nearby intersections. A delivery truck rumbled down the street. The fountain at the center of the plaza splashed rhythmically into the evening air. Yet despite the ordinary surroundings, an Uncomfortable tension settled over the crowd. People sensed that this encounter was becoming something more than a routine stop. Ethan requested identification. Marcus complied without hesitation. The officer examined the documents carefully. Everything appeared valid. No warrants. No violations. No obvious reason for concern. Still, Ethan continued searching for one. He asked where Marcus worked. Marcus answered. He asked where he was going. Marcus answered again. Each response was calm, respectful, and direct. The exchange should have ended there. Instead, it stretched on minute after minute. A woman standing near a food cart quietly shook her head. An older man seated on a nearby bench frowned as he watched. Several teenagers continued recording from different angles. The attention only seemed to strengthen Ethan's determination. He was used to being the authority in every situation. He was used to controlling the outcome. What bothered him was not Marcus's answers. It was the fact that Marcus never appeared intimidated by the process. As the sun dipped lower behind the buildings, long shadows stretched across the pavement. The golden light reflected against the glass towers downtown, painting the plaza in shades of amber and copper. Marcus glanced briefly toward the skyline. Somewhere beyond those buildings, people were waiting for him. A meeting room sat prepared. Documents were organized. Important decisions were scheduled to be discussed before sunset. Yet Marcus showed no sign of impatience. He remained exactly where he was. Ethan noticed the glance. Expecting someone, he asked. Marcus looked back at him. Eventually. The answer lingered in the air. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Across the street, unnoticed by nearly everyone, the black SUV remained parked in the same spot. Its engine was running. Inside, a driver checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. A second vehicle had quietly joined it farther down the block. No sirens. No flashing lights. No attention. Just waiting. Back in the plaza, Ethan handed the identification back. The crowd seemed to expect the encounter to end. Instead, the officer remained standing in front of Marcus. The silence between them grew heavier. Then a notification sounded from somewhere inside Marcus's jacket pocket. One missed call became 2. Then 3. Marcus did not reach for the phone. He did not even look down. But for the first time all evening, a faint concern appeared behind his eyes. Not for himself. For everyone else. Because somewhere nearby, events were already beginning to move without him. And when they finally arrived, nothing in Brookside would remain quite the same. The evening air grew cooler as the last traces of sunlight slipped behind the skyline, leaving downtown Brookside bathed in the glow of streetlights and storefront signs. The crowd around the plaza should have dispersed by now, but curiosity had rooted people in place. Something about the encounter felt unfinished. Officer Ethan Brooks sensed it too. He stood with his hands resting on his duty belt, watching Marcus read with increasing frustration. The man remained remarkably calm. No arguments. No complaints. No visible anger. Just patience. To Ethan, that patience felt almost deliberate. Across the plaza, 2 uniformed officers arrived after receiving a routine call from Ethan. They approached casually at first, expecting nothing unusual. But as one of them glanced toward Marcus, his expression changed for the briefest moment. It happened so quickly that most people missed it. A flicker of recognition. A slight tightening around the eyes. Then it was gone. He said nothing. He simply exchanged a look with his partner before continuing forward. Marcus noticed. Ethan did not. The plaza lights reflected across the polished stone walkway as distant traffic hummed through the city. Somewhere above, an airliner crossed the darkening sky, its blinking lights moving steadily toward the horizon. Time continued moving forward. Yet the strange standoff remained frozen in place. Ethan turned toward the newly arrived officers. "Everything checks out so far," he said. "But something feels off." The younger officer nodded carefully. His gaze drifted toward Marcus again. There was a question forming in his mind, one he was not yet ready to ask aloud. Marcus stood quietly, his leather folder still tucked beneath his arm. The missed calls on his phone had increased. 4. Then 5. Somewhere, people were waiting. Important people. But Marcus showed no sign of urgency. If anything, he appeared to be studying the scene around him, almost as though he were observing rather than participating. A woman standing near the fountain lowered her phone and whispered to her husband. "Why is he so calm?" she asked. The husband shrugged. "Maybe he knows something they do not." Those words drifted through the crowd like a ripple across still water. Because more and more people were beginning to wonder the same thing. Ethan continued asking questions. Marcus continued answering them. Yet the balance of the conversation had shifted. The officer no longer appeared completely certain. Tiny cracks had begun to form beneath the surface of his confidence. Then something unexpected happened. One of the newly arrived officers stepped slightly closer to Ethan and spoke in a lowered voice. Whatever he said lasted only a few seconds. But Ethan's expression hardened immediately afterward. He glanced back at Marcus, then toward the black SUV parked down the street. For the first time all evening, he seemed genuinely uncertain. Meanwhile, inside the SUV, a phone rang. The driver answered immediately. His response was brief. "Yes, sir. He is still there." A pause followed. The driver's posture straightened. "Understood. We will wait." Back in the plaza, no one knew about that conversation. No one knew that calls were being made across the city. No one knew that conference rooms remained occupied, schedules delayed, and decisions postponed because one man had not yet arrived. They saw only a police officer and a civilian standing beneath the city lights. But appearances can be deceptive. And as the evening settled over Brookside, the first pieces of a much larger story were quietly beginning to move into place. By now the crowd had stopped pretending they were merely passing through. Nearly everyone remaining in the plaza was watching. Some stood beside the fountain. Others gathered near the food carts. The glow from phone screens flickered across faces as people quietly shared recordings with friends and family. What had started as a routine encounter had transformed into a public mystery. The biggest question was no longer what Marcus Reed had done. It was who Marcus Reed really was. Officer Ethan Brooks felt the shift happening around him. He could sense the attention. He could hear the whispers. Every minute that passed without a clear resolution seemed to strengthen Marcus's position and weaken his own. That realization made him increasingly determined to regain control of the situation. Yet the harder he pushed, the more unusual everything felt. Marcus remained calm. Almost impossibly calm. The younger officer who had arrived earlier glanced toward him again. Something about Marcus seemed familiar. Not personally familiar, but recognizable in another way. It was the way he carried himself. The way he listened before speaking. The way he appeared completely unbothered by delays that would frustrate almost anyone else. Those were not the habits of an ordinary man caught in an unexpected situation. Across town, inside a conference room overlooking the riverfront, several officials sat around a polished table. A large digital clock displayed the time. The meeting should have started nearly 30 minutes earlier. Coffee cups sat untouched. Laptops remained open. Yet nobody had left. They were waiting. One woman checked her phone and frowned. "Still no word?" she asked. A man near the window shook his head. "Not yet." Back in the plaza, Marcus finally reached into his jacket and silenced the constant notifications. Ethan immediately noticed. "Important calls," he asked. Marcus looked at the phone screen for a brief moment before sliding it back into his pocket. Important to some people, he replied. The answer was simple. Yet somehow it only deepened the mystery. A cool breeze moved through the plaza, rustling nearby trees and carrying the distant sound of a train horn from the edge of the city. Night had fully arrived now. Streetlights reflected against the pavement. Storefront windows glowed with warm light. The black SUV remained parked in place. So did the second vehicle farther down the block. Inside the first SUV, the driver received another call. This time his expression changed. He sat up straighter. Understood, he said quietly. They are on their way. The call ended. The driver looked toward the plaza. Whatever was coming had already begun moving. Meanwhile, Ethan was unaware of all of it. His focus remained fixed on Marcus. He believed he was uncovering something hidden. In reality, he was standing directly in the middle of a story he did not yet understand. Then the younger officer's radio crackled softly. A brief message came through. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the radio. Then at Marcus. Then at Ethan. For a moment he seemed unsure whether to speak. The crowd noticed none of this. They saw only silence. But beneath that silence, events were accelerating. Invisible threads were pulling together from different corners of Brookside. Meetings were paused. Calls were made. Vehicles changed direction. And standing beneath the city lights, Marcus Reed appeared to know exactly what was about to happen. The message that came through the younger officer's radio lasted less than 5 seconds, yet it changed everything. He lowered the device slowly and looked toward Marcus Reed with a level of attention that had not been there before. He still said nothing. The plaza remained wrapped in uncertainty. People shifted their weight from one foot to another. Some checked the time. Others continued recording. Nobody wanted to leave before discovering how the story ended. What they did not realize was that the real story had begun long before anyone gathered around that fountain. Months earlier, concerns had quietly surfaced across Brookside. Complaints that never seemed to reach final conclusions. Reports that disappeared into filing systems. Cases that raised questions but produced few answers. Individually, none of them appeared significant. Together, they formed a pattern. A pattern someone had been studying very carefully. Marcus stood beneath the streetlights, his expression unchanged. To the crowd he looked like an ordinary citizen caught in an inconvenient situation. To a handful of people elsewhere in the city, he represented something entirely different. Inside a secure office several miles away, a digital screen displayed dozens of files arranged across multiple categories. Dates. Locations. Internal communications. Public complaints. Policy reviews. Every detail had been organized with extraordinary precision. A woman seated at the desk stared at the screen inside. He should have been here by now, she said quietly. Across from her, another official nodded. He will get here when he is finished. Back in the plaza, Ethan Brooks continued trying to understand why the situation felt increasingly uncomfortable. Nothing Marcus had said was threatening. Nothing he had done appeared suspicious. Yet Ethan could not shake the feeling that important information remained hidden just beyond reach. The officer glanced toward the black SUV again. Then toward the second vehicle. He noticed them now. For the first time all evening, he realized they had not moved. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through him. Marcus followed his gaze. Interesting evening, isn't it? He said calmly. Ethan did not answer immediately. Around them, the city lights reflected off nearby windows like scattered stars. The fountain continued its steady rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the passing hour. Time kept moving. So did the investigation that nobody in the plaza knew existed. For months, information had been collected quietly. Interviews conducted discreetly. Records reviewed carefully. Every piece added to a larger picture. No dramatic confrontations. No public announcements. Just patience. The kind of patience that often reveals more than pressure ever could. That was why Marcus remained calm. He understood that truth had its own schedule. It did not need to be rushed. The younger officer's radio crackled again. This time he listened more closely. His eyes widened. Then he looked directly at Marcus. A silent realization passed across his face. He finally understood why the name sounded familiar. Not because he had met Marcus before. Because he had seen it in official briefings. Very official briefings. Suddenly, the strange confidence. The missed calls. The waiting vehicles. The delayed meetings. All of it began to make sense. And standing in the middle of the plaza, surrounded by strangers who believed they were witnessing a random encounter, Marcus Reed quietly watched the first pieces of the truth begin falling into place. The realization hit the younger officer like a sudden change in weather. He kept his expression controlled, but his thoughts were racing. During a departmental briefing several months earlier, a photograph had appeared on a presentation screen. The meeting had focused on oversight reviews, accountability programs, and a series of confidential evaluations taking place across multiple cities. Most officers had forgotten the presentation within days. He had not. And now, standing beneath the lights of the plaza, he was almost certain he was looking at the same man. Marcus Reed noticed the change immediately. Not because the officer said anything, but because Marcus had spent years learning to read people. A slight shift in posture. A longer glance than usual. A moment of hesitation before speaking. Small details often revealed more than words. Ethan Brooks remained unaware of the silent discovery unfolding beside him. His attention stayed fixed on the growing crowd and the uncomfortable feeling that events were slipping beyond his control. Every instinct told him that something important was happening. The problem was that he could not identify what it was. Across the city, several calls were taking place simultaneously. In government offices. Inside administrative buildings. In conference rooms where discussions had been paused for nearly an hour. Names were being mentioned. Schedules were being adjusted. Updates were being requested. One question appeared repeatedly. Where is Marcus Reed? Back in the plaza, another notification briefly illuminated Marcus's phone inside his pocket. This time he looked down. The screen displayed a single message. No greeting. No explanation. Just 3 words. They are arriving. Marcus read the message once and placed the phone away. His expression never changed. Yet for the first time that evening, he seemed relieved. Ethan noticed. Good news? He asked. Marcus looked toward the far end of the street. Depends. On your perspective. The answer lingered in the air. The crowd followed his gaze. At first, nobody saw anything unusual. Cars moved through traffic. Pedestrians crossed intersections. The city continued its ordinary rhythm. Then headlights appeared farther down the avenue. Several vehicles turned onto the street at nearly the same time. They were not moving fast. They were not drawing attention to themselves. Yet something about their coordinated arrival immediately stood out. The younger officer saw them and quietly swallowed. The second officer noticed them too. Neither said a word. Ethan folded his arms. Friends of yours? Marcus remained silent for a moment. The distant vehicles continued approaching. Their reflections slid across storefront windows and polished office towers. Somewhere nearby, a clock tower chimed the hour. The sound echoed through the evening air. Then Marcus finally answered. Not exactly. Another minute passed. The vehicles drew closer. People in the crowd began exchanging curious looks. Several phones shifted toward the approaching lights. Whatever had started as a routine encounter was clearly becoming something else. Marcus stood calmly beneath the streetlights, watching the approaching convoy with the same quiet confidence he had carried all evening. He had never raised his voice. He had never argued. He had never attempted to leave. Because unlike everyone else in the plaza, Marcus had known from the beginning that this moment was coming. The only thing he had been waiting for was for the truth to finally arrive. The approaching vehicles rolled into the plaza with quiet precision, drawing every eye toward them. There were no flashing lights. No dramatic entrances. No urgency. Somehow that made the moment even more unsettling. The crowd fell silent as the first SUV came to a stop near the fountain. The second parked behind it. Then a third arrived. Doors opened. Men and women in professional attire stepped out, their movements calm and purposeful. They were not police officers. They were not reporters. Yet the confidence they carried immediately commanded attention. Ethan Brooks straightened his posture. The younger officer beside him lowered his gaze. He already knew what was coming. Marcus Reed remained exactly where he was. One of the newly arrived individuals, a woman in a dark gray suit, walked directly toward him. She did not hesitate. She did not look confused. She did not ask questions. When she reached Marcus, she offered a respectful nod. "Sir, we have been trying to reach you for nearly an hour." The words seemed to freeze the air itself. Several people in the crowd exchanged stunned looks. Ethan stared at the woman. Then at Marcus. Then back at the woman again. For the first time all evening, uncertainty overtook his confidence. Marcus gave a small apologetic smile. "I got delayed." The woman glanced briefly toward Ethan and the surrounding officers. Her expression revealed nothing, but her eyes seemed to understand everything. Behind her, several other officials approached carrying folders and electronic tablets. One man stopped a few feet away and quietly said, "The meeting has been postponed. Everyone is waiting." The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Waiting. Everyone. The words echoed through the minds of those listening. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Important people waited for important people. And suddenly he was no longer certain who Marcus Reed truly was. The younger officer finally stepped forward. His voice was careful. Respectful. "Sir," he said to Marcus, "are you with the Oversight Task Force?" Several heads turned immediately. The plaza became so quiet that even the sound of water from the fountain seemed louder. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once. The reaction was instant. The younger officer's face lost all color. Ethan frowned. He had heard the name before. Federal Civil Rights Oversight Task Force. Independent reviews. Accountability investigations. Policy audits. The kind of organization that quietly examined systems from the inside. The kind that showed up after problems had already begun. Marcus looked around the plaza. At the crowd. At the officers. At the phones recording every second. Then he spoke calmly. "I am the regional director assigned to review public accountability practices throughout this district." No one moved. No one spoke. Ethan felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Every strange detail from the evening suddenly connected. The missed calls. The waiting vehicles. The delayed meetings. The unusual confidence. The patience. Marcus had never been trying to impress anyone. He had never been trying to intimidate anyone. He had simply known the truth from the beginning. Around the plaza, whispers spread through the crowd. Some people stared in disbelief. Others looked toward Ethan. The officer who had believed he was leading the situation now appeared completely lost inside it. Marcus glanced toward the city skyline where office lights still glowed against the night sky. Then he looked back at Ethan. There was no anger in his expression. No satisfaction. Only calm certainty. Because the reveal was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of consequences that would reach far beyond a single evening in Brookside. For several seconds after the revelation, nobody seemed to know what to say. The plaza that had been filled with whispers only moments earlier now stood in complete silence. Even the people recording with their phones appeared frozen, trying to process what they had just heard. Officer Ethan Brooks felt every eye turning toward him. The attention that had once felt empowering now felt impossible to ignore. Across the city, however, events were already moving forward. The delayed meeting finally began less than an hour later. Inside a secure conference room overlooking the river, officials reviewed months of findings collected throughout the district. Reports were opened. Data was examined. Patterns were discussed. What emerged was not a story about one officer or one incident. It was a much larger picture. Complaints that had been dismissed too quickly. Procedures applied inconsistently. Public concerns that deserved more attention than they had received. Marcus Reed sat at the head of the table as the presentation unfolded. The same calm expression he had carried in the plaza remained unchanged. He listened carefully. He asked questions. He reviewed evidence. The process was methodical and professional. There were no dramatic speeches. No emotional confrontations. Only facts. That was how meaningful accountability worked. Not through anger. Through truth. Meanwhile, back in Brookside, the video recorded in the plaza spread rapidly across social media. Thousands of people watched it before midnight. Then tens of thousands. By morning, local news stations were discussing the footage. Community leaders requested meetings. Residents shared their experiences. Conversations that had remained private for years suddenly moved into public view. Ethan watched the coverage from home. The previous evening replayed repeatedly across television screens and online feeds. Every decision. Every question. Every moment. For the first time, he was forced to view the situation through the eyes of everyone else. The experience was uncomfortable. Not because of public criticism, but because it forced him to confront questions he had never seriously asked himself before. Why had he been so certain? Why had he ignored warning signs? Why had he continued when nothing justified continuing? Those questions followed him everywhere. Days later, independent reviews expanded across multiple departments. Additional records were examined. Internal procedures were reassessed. Training programs were evaluated. What began as a single encounter in a city plaza became the catalyst for broader reforms that reached far beyond one evening. Marcus remained focused on the larger mission. He never spoke publicly about personal frustration. He never demanded punishment. Whenever reporters asked about the incident, he redirected the conversation toward responsibility, transparency, and trust. That approach surprised many people. They expected outrage. Instead, they found discipline. They expected revenge. Instead, they found purpose. Weeks later, standing before a room filled with civic leaders, Marcus reviewed the final recommendations. The work had been extensive. The findings had been difficult. But meaningful progress was finally possible. As he closed the final folder, he looked around the room and understood something important. The real consequences of that evening had never been hidden from him. They had only been hidden from everyone else. And now, one by one, they were finally coming into view. 3 months later, Brookside looked the same from a distance. The same skyline reflected in the river. The same traffic moved through downtown streets. The same fountain continued flowing in the plaza where everything had started. Yet beneath the familiar surface, something had changed. New accountability procedures had been implemented. Additional community review programs had been established. Training standards had been expanded. Conversations that once happened behind closed doors were now taking place in public forums where residents and officials sat at the same table. Progress was not perfect. It never was. But it was real. On a cool autumn afternoon, Marcus Reed returned to the city one final time. The plaza was quieter than he remembered. Children played near the fountain. Office workers crossed the square carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Most people passing through had no idea how significant that location had become. Marcus paused near the same spot where he had stood months earlier. He looked around for a moment and allowed himself a small smile. Not because he had one. Because the mission had accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. Truth had reached the places where it was needed most. Nearby, a local reporter approached and asked a question that had followed him for weeks. After everything that happened, do you feel vindicated? Marcus considered the question carefully. The answer would appear on evening broadcasts and social media clips within hours. Yet his response was simple. This was never about me. The reporter looked surprised. Marcus continued. People often think accountability is about punishment. It is not. Accountability is about trust. When trust is damaged, the goal is not revenge. The goal is repair. Those words spread throughout the city almost as quickly as the original video had months before. Community leaders quoted them during meetings. Editorial writers discussed them in newspapers. Teachers even referenced them in classrooms. Because the lesson reached beyond one officer, one department, or one city. It spoke to something larger. The responsibility that comes with authority. The importance of fairness. The danger of assumptions. Across town, Ethan Brooks watched the interview from a television mounted inside a waiting room. The past few months had forced him to confront difficult truths about himself and the choices he had made. The process had not been easy. Real growth rarely is. But for the first time in a long time, he found himself listening instead of defending. Learning instead of assuming. The transformation was quiet. Almost invisible. Yet perhaps those are the changes that matter most. As evening settled over Brookside, the city lights slowly illuminated the streets once again. The fountain sparkled beneath the glow of nearby lamps. Cars moved through intersections. Life continued forward. Marcus turned and began walking toward a waiting vehicle. Another assignment awaited. Another city. Another challenge. Before entering the vehicle, he glanced back one last time at the plaza. The place where hidden consequences had finally become visible. The place where assumptions had collided with truth. The place where a simple encounter revealed something far greater than anyone expected. Then he stepped inside and closed the door. The vehicle pulled away. The city disappeared behind him. And somewhere in the distance, carried through the lights and noise of an ordinary evening, one lesson remained. Power can command attention. Authority can demand obedience. But character is what earns respect. And in the end, truth has a way of arriving exactly when it is needed most.